My stepfather pointed toward the front door and told me to leave, convinced he was evicting a daughter who had zero assets to her name. I walked out of that anniversary dinner without shedding a tear. They believed they were cutting off a leech, but they had no idea what I carried in my purse. It was a single deed that proved their precious family estate actually belonged to the one person they just exiled. I am Mara Whitfield, 34 years old, and as I walked up the driveway of the expansive colonial house in Riverton Glen, I told myself that I only needed to survive 3 hours. It was the 25th wedding anniversary of my mother and stepfather, a silver jubilee that demanded attendance regardless of the fractures beneath the surface. The house glowed with that perfect warm amber light that wealthy families use to advertise their happiness to the neighbors. I smoothed down my skirt, checked my watch, which read 6:45 in the evening, and promised myself I would be a statue. I would smile, eat, and leave. I would not let them see the blood in the water. The dining room was staged like a magazine spread. Crystal glasses caught the light of the chandelier, and the centerpiece was a towering arrangement of white lilies that smelled suffocatingly sweet. My sister, Tessa, sat across from me. At 32, she was the golden standard by which my failures were measured. She was glowing, fresh from a promotion at a marketing firm in the city, and she held court with the ease of someone who had never been interrupted in her life. "It's just a massive responsibility," Tessa said, swirling her Cabernet. "They want me to lead the entire Northeast Division." I told them I'd have to think about it, but honestly, I think I'm ready. My mother, Linda, beamed, her hands clasped under her chin. "Of course you are, sweetheart. You were born for leadership." I focused on cutting my roast chicken into precise 1-inch squares. I thought I was invisible, but Tessa needed a foil to make her shine brighter. She turned her gaze toward me, her smile tight and pitying. "It's a shame Mara never talks about her work," Tessa said, addressing the table but pinning me with her eyes. I asked her about her day last week, and she just changed the subject. She is always so secretive about everything. The table went quiet. The word hung there, loaded with the implication that I was hiding shame, poverty, or both. I could have let it slide. I should have let it slide. But the condescension in her voice scraped against a nerve I had left exposed. I placed my fork down gently. "You are mistaken, Tessa," I said, my voice steady. "I am not secretive. I am simply cautious." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The clinking of silverware stopped. My mother froze, her wine glass halfway to her mouth. In the Hartman household, correcting the golden child was a cardinal sin, but correcting her with dignity was an act of war. Gerald Hartman, my stepfather, dropped his napkin onto his plate. His face, usually flushed with wine by this hour, turned a darker shade of crimson. He looked at the relatives gathered around the table, an aunt from Connecticut, a cousin from the city, and his chest puffed out with performative righteousness. You know, I have had just about enough of this attitude. Gerald boomed, his voice shaking the crystal. "We invite you into this home. We feed you, and you sit there with that superior look on your face. If you cannot learn to be grateful, if you cannot learn to know your place, then get out." I looked at my mother. I waited for her to intervene, to say that it was just a misunderstanding, to be a parent. Linda did not look at Gerald. She looked at me. Her eyes were devoid of affection. They held only annoyance. I was not her daughter in that moment. I was a smudge on the lens of a perfect family portrait, a glitch that needed to be edited out. Tessa leaned across the table, under the pretense of reaching for the salt. Her voice dropped to a whisper, audible only to me, dripping with toxic sympathy. "You always make things harder than they have to be. Mara," she hissed softly. "You do it because you have nothing." Something inside me snapped. It was not a loud break, but a quiet, final fracture, like a key breaking off in a lock. I stood up. I did not slam the chair. I picked up my linen napkin and folded it into a neat rectangle next to my untouched plate. Happy anniversary, I said. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I could feel their eyes on my back, burning holes through my coat. I walked through the foyer, past the framed photos that featured Tessa in every single frame, and opened the heavy oak front door. As the latch clicked shut behind me, the silence of the night hit me harder than the shouting had. The cool air of Riverton Glen filled my lungs, but it did not bring relief. The pain that washed over me was specific and sharp. It was not the pain of being evicted from a dinner party. It was the realization that they had not just kicked me out, they had erased me. In front of witnesses, in front of the family, they had severed the limb to save the body. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my heels. They thought they had discarded a daughter who had nothing to lose. They thought the story ended the moment I disappeared into the dark. They were wrong. The story was just beginning. The morning sun hit my apartment floor like a spotlight, exposing the dust I had been too busy to clean. But the real noise was coming from my phone. It had been vibrating on the nightstand since 7 o'clock. I did not pick it up. I lay there and watched the names scroll across the screen. Aunt Sarah, Cousin Mike, even my mother's sister from Ohio. None of them were calling to ask if I was hurt. None of them were calling to ask why a grown woman had been ordered out of her family home like a misbehaving dog. I finally answered one call, just to stop the noise. It was Aunt Sarah. "Mara, honestly," she said, her voice tight with that specific brand of family disappointment that masks itself as concern. "Why couldn't you just suck it up for one night? You know how your father gets." "He is not my father," I said flatly. "You are making this so difficult." She sighed. "Linda is devastated. She says you ruined the whole mood." I hung up. I did not slam the phone down. I just pressed the red button. Then the text from Gerald arrived. It popped up on my screen. A block of gray text that seemed to pollute the air in my bedroom. "When you learn how to behave like a respectful daughter, we can talk about your apology." I stared at the text for 3 seconds. Then I deleted it. No hesitation, no anger. Just a cold, mechanical removal of trash. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the silence of my apartment wrapping around me. My mind drifted back to the architecture of my childhood. It was always the same blueprint. Tessa was the sensitive one. If Tessa cried, the world stopped to dry her tears. If Tessa broke a plate, it was an accident. But me, I was the strong one. And in the Hartman house, being strong did not mean you were admired. It meant you were expected to endure. Strength was just a permission slip for them to load more weight onto my shoulders. I opened a fresh notebook. I started writing down the calls, the texts, the specific words they used. It was a habit from my job in risk compliance. You document everything: difficult, cold, ungrateful, secretive. I looked at the list. It was not random. It was a script. They were all reading from the same sheet of paper, orchestrated to paint me as the villain so they would not have to look at their own reflections. My phone rang again, a number I rarely saw. It was a distant aunt, someone who usually only called for weddings or funerals. "Hello, Mara," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I just wanted to check on you. Tessa told me everything." "Did she?" I asked. "Yes. She is so worried. Poor thing. She told me that you have been, well, unstable lately." The word hit me like a bucket of ice water. Unstable. That was not a complaint about my behavior. That was a diagnosis. That was a legal term wrapped in gossip. If I was unstable, then my anger was invalid. If I was unstable, my decisions could be questioned. If I was unstable, I could be managed. Is that what she said I asked? "She said you are under a lot of pressure," the aunt continued, unaware she was feeding me the evidence I needed. "Maybe you should take some time off. Get some help." I did not argue. I did not defend my sanity. I simply said goodbye and ended the call. For the first time in my life, I realized that silence was not surrender. It was camouflage. I stood up and walked to the closet in my hallway. I pushed aside the coats and knelt down to the small, fireproof safe bolted to the floor. My hands were steady as I spun the dial. Click, click, click. The heavy door swung open. Inside, beneath my passport and birth certificate, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out. The paper felt heavy, substantial. Inside were the documents for a trust fund established in my name years ago, a financial fortress I had never mentioned to a single soul. I knew my family. I knew that if Gerald or Linda knew this money existed, it would suddenly become our money. It would be guilt-tripped into a renovation for their house or a bailout for one of Gerald's failing business ventures. I held the envelope to my chest. They thought I was destitute. They thought I was desperate. They had no idea I had a parachute. I was about to turn off the lights and try to sleep when my phone lit up one last time. It was a text message from a number I did not recognize. They kicked you out because they think you have no leverage. But you hold the key they lost long ago. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I was not alone in this game. Someone else was watching, and for the first time in 24 hours, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a player who had just been dealt an ace. The diner was located just off the highway, a place where the coffee was bitter and the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. I checked my watch. It was 10:15 at night. The man sitting in the back booth looked out of place in his pressed button-down shirt, despite the grease stains on the table. It was Rory, the accountant who had managed my stepfather's books for nearly a decade before vanishing 2 years ago. He looked older now, the lines around his eyes etched deep with stress. "I did not think you would come," Rory said as I slid into the booth opposite him. He kept his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee to stop them from shaking. "You said they were lying," I replied, keeping my voice low. "You said I held a key." Rory glanced around the empty diner before leaning in. "Gerald is in trouble, Mara. Real trouble. His liquidity is gone. He has been moving money between accounts to keep the appearance of wealth, but the music is about to stop. And he is trying to attach your name to the wreckage." I frowned. "My name I have nothing to do with his business. I have never signed a single document for Hartman Classic Homes." Rory laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Are you sure about that? Because Gerald believes you are the weak link. He thinks he can bully you into silence because he thinks you are broke." He paused, looking me dead in the eye. "That house in Riverton Glen, it is not clean. There is a limited liability company that holds the deed, not Gerald and Linda. And you signed a transfer of authority document for that LLC 3 years ago. The air left my lungs. That is impossible." "Think, Mara," Rory urged. "Did Tessa ever ask you to sign something? Maybe she said it was for a delivery or a permit." The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a Saturday afternoon, 3 years ago. I was visiting for lunch. Tessa had come running out to the porch, holding a clipboard and a pen, laughing about a courier who was in a rush. "Can you just scribble your name here for me?" she had asked. "My hands are covered in oil and the guy is waiting." I had signed. I had not read it. I had trusted my sister. "I see you remember," Rory said, reading the horror on my face. "Here is the part you need to know. Gerald is building a narrative. He is going to claim you are mentally unstable, that you were manipulated by bad actors into financial ruin, and that he needs to take control of your assets to save you. If he gets conservatorship, he gets access to everything in your name, including the liability he already pinned on you." I left the diner feeling like the ground was dissolving beneath my feet. I did not go home. I pulled into a parking lot and dialed the number of a lawyer I had met through work, a specialist in forensic accounting named David. It was late, but he answered. I need you to run a full credit and asset check on my social security number, I said, my voice trembling with rage. Right now. I need to know what they have done. It will take a few hours to get the deep dive. David said, I will call you the second I have a hit. I sat in the dark car and waited. The silence was heavy. I replayed every interaction, every favor I had done for my family. They had weaponized my compliance. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang. I found something, David said, and his tone was grave. There is a home equity line of credit opened 4 years ago at a regional bank. It is under your name, Mara. The principal is nearly $50,000, and it is maxed out. I never opened that. I said. I pulled the digital copy of the application. David continued, I am emailing it to you now. I opened the file on my phone. There, at the bottom of the page, was my name. The signature looked like mine at first glance. It had the same slant, the same general shape. But then I zoomed in. My hand shook as I held the screen closer. I knew how I wrote my name. I crossed my T's with a sharp upward flick. This signature had a soft, looping cross. It was a flourish I had seen 1,000 times on birthday cards and passive-aggressive notes left on the fridge. That is not my handwriting, I whispered, the realization turning the sadness in my gut into cold, hard resolve. It looks like a good forgery, David said. No, I said. It is not just a forgery. It is a fingerprint. I stared at the loop of the letters. It was Tessa. My sister had not just betrayed me. She had stolen my identity to fund the very lifestyle she used to mock me. She had mocked me for having nothing while she was wearing clothes bought with debt she took out in my name. Document everything. I told David, do not file a fraud report yet. I want to see how deep this goes. I hung up the phone. They wanted to paint me as unstable. They wanted to say I was the problem. They had no idea that by trying to bury me, they had just handed me the shovel to dig up their own graves. The fluorescent lights of Northline Ridge Advisory were calibrated to a specific temperature that discouraged fatigue, a cold white glare that made every spreadsheet look like an indictment. I sat at my desk, surrounded by 2 monitors displaying compliance algorithms. This was my world. In risk management, we learned that people lie, but data trails are eternal. I knew exactly how systems were built to trap people, and I knew how people like Gerald used those systems to create cages for everyone else. My cell phone buzzed. It was David, the lawyer I had retained. I picked up on the first ring, keeping my voice low enough not to alert the junior analysts in the cubicles nearby. I reviewed the filing patterns, David said, his tone clipped and professional. If they are building a case for conservatorship, they are going to argue that you are under undue influence. They need to paint a picture that you are not making your own decisions. They will say you are erratic. They have already started spreading that rumor. I replied, staring at a row of red flags on my monitor. They are telling family members I am unstable. We need to lock down your assets. Mara. If they get a temporary order, they freeze you out. You need to know exactly what is in that trust fund you mentioned. I hung up and opened the digital scan of the trust documents I had uploaded to my secure server that morning. For years, I had assumed the money came from my grandmother, a quiet woman who obeyed every rule. I was wrong. I scrolled to the grantor signature line. The name was written in sharp, defiant cursive Eloise Vance. My breath caught in my throat. Eloise was my great-aunt, the woman who had been excommunicated from the family narrative because she had called Gerald a fraud to his face 20 years ago. The family said she was crazy. Now, looking at the legal structure she had built, I realized she was the only sane one among them. I read the addendum to the trust. It was explicit. The beneficiary, Mara Whitfield, shall have sole and absolute discretion over all assets. No individual by the name of Hartman or any relation by marriage shall have access, control, or benefit from these funds under any circumstances. She had built a wall around me from the grave. But as I scrolled deeper into the asset list, I found something that made the office spin. The trust did not just hold stocks and bonds. 3 years ago, through a shell corporation, the trust had purchased a distressed mortgage portfolio from a regional lender. I cross-referenced the property address in the portfolio. 14 Oak Lane, Riverton Glen. My heart hammered against my ribs. My parents did not own their house. They thought they paid their mortgage to a faceless bank. But in reality, that bank had sold the debt. The trust my trust owned the note. They were living in a house that I effectively controlled. If they missed a payment, or if they violated the terms of the deed, I was the one who held the power to foreclose. "You didn't leave me money, Eloise," I whispered to the screen. "You left me a weapon. I closed the file. I did not need to scream. I did not need to make a scene. I just needed to let the paperwork do the heavy lifting. I was not going to use the money to destroy them. I was going to use the truth." My phone lit up again. This time, it was a text message from Tessa. "Hey, sis, I know things got heated. Let's do a private dinner. Just us. Mom and Gerald are so worried about you. Come over on Thursday night, we can fix this." I looked at the calendar. Thursday was the 16th. I checked the email David had sent me earlier regarding the fraudulent line of credit. The bank had flagged the account for a mandatory in-person identity verification. The deadline to present the ID was Friday morning. If I did not show up at the bank, the account would freeze, and the fraud would be exposed. Tessa did not want a reconciliation. She wanted me in the room on Thursday night so she could guilt me, threaten me, or manipulate me into validating the debt she had racked up in my name before the bank locked her out. I typed my reply, my fingers steady. "I'll be there." I was walking into a trap, but for the first time, I was the one bringing the cage. I arrived at my mother's house at exactly 7 o'clock. This time, there were no cars lining the driveway, no caterers, and no extended family to witness the performance. We sat in the smaller dining room off the kitchen, a space usually reserved for breakfast, but tonight the air felt heavier than it had in the grand hall. The table was round, forcing an intimacy that felt more like a cage than a gathering. Gerald sat opposite me. He was not drinking wine tonight. His hands were folded on the table, and when he looked up, his face wore a mask of practiced concern that I had never seen before. It was the look of a predator trying to convince the prey that the trap was actually a shelter. "Mara, thank you for coming," Gerald said, his voice terrifyingly soft. We have been so worried about you. You have changed lately. You seem lost." I did not touch the water glass in front of me. "I am not lost. Gerald, I am just awake." My mother, Linda, reached out as if to touch my hand, but she stopped short when I did not move to meet her. She looked tired, her makeup applied a little too heavily to hide the stress lines. "We just want to fix this," Linda said, her voice trembling slightly. "Families fight, Mara, but we do not air our dirty laundry. We cannot let outsiders see things that make us look broken. It was never about the relationship. It was always about the optical integrity of the Hartman brand." Tessa was sitting next to Gerald. She was not eating. Next to her plate was a thin blue folder. She pushed it toward the center of the table, her movements jerky and anxious. "Look, let's just put all the drama behind us," Tessa said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "There are just some loose ends we need to tie up. Administrative things. If we just sign a few papers tonight, we can make all the rumors go away." She tapped the folder. She did not open it. She just tapped it, as if the rhythm would hypnotize me into compliance. "What kind of papers?" I asked. "Just standard stuff," Tessa said quickly. Too quickly. "We need to consolidate some family accounts to protect everyone. It is just a formality." I reached for the folder. Gerald's hand twitched, but he did not stop me. I flipped it open. The document on top was a retroactive authorization form. It was dense legal jargon, but the letterhead belonged to the regional bank David had identified the night before. "I am going to read this," I said. Gerald's soft mask cracked. The vein in his forehead pulsed. You do not need to read it. Mara, it is standard language. We are trying to help you here. You are in a bad state, and we are trying to create a safety net. If it is a safety net, I said, scanning the paragraphs, then why does it indemnify the signer against identity theft claims? Just sign the damn paper, Gerald snapped, his voice booming in the small room. You are a child in this house, and you will do as you are told. You have nothing without us. I looked up from the paper. I looked directly at Tessa. She was staring at the table, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. Why does this paperwork relate to a credit line that was opened using my social security number 4 years ago? I asked. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a bomb that had just landed but not yet detonated. Tessa froze. She did not blink. She did not breathe. For one single heartbeat, her eyes darted to Gerald in panic, a reflex of guilt so pure it was almost blinding. Gerald slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. That is paranoid nonsense. You are making things up because you are sick. This is exactly why we need to intervene. Linda let out a sob, burying her face in her hands. Mara, please, why are you attacking us? Why are you doing this to your sister? They were trying to drown the truth in noise. They wanted to scream over the facts until I doubted my own reality. But I was not the same person who had walked out of the anniversary dinner. I was not looking for their approval anymore. I was looking for their confession, and I had just gotten it in the form of Tessa's terror. I stood up. I did not take the folder. I did not finish my water. You are hallucinating, Gerald shouted, standing up to loom over me. Sit down, no, I said calmly. I am done sitting down. I walked toward the door. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my voice remained steady, cold and final. From now on, I said, turning back to face them one last time, everything is to be communicated through my lawyer. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving them in the wreckage of their own failed ambush. They thought they could bully me into signing away my rights. Instead, they had just confirmed exactly where to aim the cannon. The lobby of Northline Ridge Advisory was designed to intimidate, a cavern of glass and steel meant to signal corporate invincibility. But Gerald Hartman stood in the center of the atrium as if he had personally laid the foundation. It was 10 in the morning. I had just stepped off the elevator to grab a coffee when I saw him. He was not wearing a visitor badge. He was standing with his hands on his hips, surveying the security guards with a look of disdain that suggested he was moments away from firing them all. He spotted me before I could retreat. He did not shout. He closed the distance between us with a stride that was aggressive and practiced. When he stopped, he was close enough that I could smell his cologne, a scent that used to smell like safety but now smelled like suffocation. You think you are better than everyone when you are silent, Gerald said, his voice low but vibrating with venom. You think walking away makes you a winner. You have nothing backing you up. No assets, no name, nothing. I stood my ground. The receptionists were watching. I do not need backing, I said, my voice flat. I need peace. Gerald's eyes narrowed. The mask of the concerned father slipped entirely, revealing the desperate businessman underneath. He leaned in, lowering his voice even further. Where is your money coming from? He asked. It was not a question of curiosity. It was an interrogation. He had sensed the confidence in my refusal to sign his papers, and it terrified him. He knew I should be desperate, but I wasn't, and that gap in his calculation was driving him mad. That is none of your business, I said. I am making it my business, he hissed. If you are stealing... I turned to the nearest security officer, a large man named Marcus who I greeted every morning. I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed. "Marcus," I said, "this gentleman is harassing me and does not have an appointment. Please escort him out." Gerald's face turned a violent shade of purple. "You wouldn't dare. I am your father. Step this way." "Sir," Marcus said, stepping between us like a human wall. Gerald looked at me, then at the guard, and realized he had no power here. This was not his dining table. He spun on his heel and stormed out, but the humiliation lingered in the air like smoke. By 2 in the afternoon, the retaliation had begun. My phone started lighting up with messages from cousins I had not spoken to in years. The narrative had shifted. Tessa had been busy. She was telling the family that I was being manipulated by a boyfriend or a cult, that I was showing signs of psychological distress, and that the family needed to step in to save me from myself. She was painting a picture of a woman who had lost her mind to explain why I had rejected their help. My lawyer, David, called me at 3:30. "You need to brace yourself." "Mara," David said, "I have a contact at the county clerk's office. Gerald has made inquiries about the procedure for filing an emergency adult conservatorship. He is trying to argue that you are incapacitated and cannot manage your own affairs. He wants to lock me up to get my signature," I said, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. "He wants control," David corrected. "But we have something that might stop him dead in his tracks. The bank just sent over the preliminary fraud report on that line of credit." I gripped the phone tighter. "And they confirmed the signature on the primary application is a mismatch," David said. "But that is not the headline. The loan required a co-signer because your credit history at the time was too thin. The co-signer verified their identity in person." I stopped breathing. I had assumed Tessa had forged everything. Who was it, I asked, though a sick feeling in my stomach told me I already knew the answer. "It was Linda Hartman," David said. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My mother. She had not just stood by and watched, she had participated. She had walked into a bank, sat across from a loan officer, and co-signed a loan that she knew was fraudulent, using my name to give Tessa money, all while looking me in the eye at every Sunday dinner for 4 years. "Send me the file," I whispered. "Mara, are you okay?" "I am fine," I said, and I meant it. The last thread of guilt I held for destroying their reputation had just snapped. "They want to prove I am unstable. I am going to show them exactly how focused I can be." The ballroom of the Quillhaven Foundation was decorated in shades of silver and ice blue, a color scheme that felt appropriate for a room full of people who expressed power through silence rather than volume. I stood at the podium, the microphone cool against my fingers. I was not there as a victim. I was there as a donor and a speaker on the topic of financial literacy. The room was filled with the town's elite lawyers, bank executives, and local politicians. I kept my speech brief. I did not mention my family. I did not mention the fraud. True autonomy begins with the ability to say no. I told the crowd, my voice projecting clearly without a tremor. Financial transparency is not just about numbers. It is about boundaries. And sometimes, enforcing those boundaries is the only way to survive. The applause was polite and respectful. As I stepped down, a reporter from the local Gazette approached me. He held a glass of champagne, but his eyes were sharp. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, leaning in. "There are rumors circulating about a petition for conservatorship filed by your father. Sources say there are concerns about your stability." I smiled. It was a cold, practiced smile I had learned from watching Gerald close business deals. "I am perfectly fine," I replied, making sure my voice carried just enough for the surrounding circle to hear. "I am simply no longer silent. There is a difference." I saw them then. Gerald and Tessa had just entered the ballroom. They were clearly there on a damage control mission, likely expecting to find me making a scene or looking disheveled. Instead, they froze. They watched as the senior partner of the largest law firm in the county shook my hand warmly. They watched as the vice president of the bank nodded at me with respect. Tessa rushed over to me, her face pale. She grabbed my elbow, her grip tight and desperate. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice trembling. You are not supposed to be here. You are embarrassing us." I pulled my arm away gently. "I was invited. Tessa. Unlike you. David." My lawyer stepped out of the crowd and handed me a thick manila folder. He did not look at Tessa. "The forensic analysis is complete," David said. "We traced the funds from the home equity line of credit. The money did not just vanish. It was transferred directly into the operating account of Hartman Classic Homes." I opened the file. There it was. $50,000, stolen from my future to patch a hole in Gerald's sinking ship. They had not just used my name to buy Tessa clothes, they used my credit to keep Gerald's ego afloat. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was my mother. I excused myself and walked to a quiet corner near the terrace doors to answer. "Mara, please." Linda sobbed into the phone, her voice thick with panic. "You have to stop this. Gerald is furious. He says you are ruining everything. You co-signed the loan. Mom," I said, "you sat in a bank and lied to a federal institution." "I didn't have a choice," she cried, her breath hitching. He told me it was just a formality. He said the business needed cash flow or we would lose the house. I just did what he said. You always do what he says. I said, "That is why we are here." I hung up. I could not comfort her. Her compliance was the weapon that had wounded me. As I turned back toward the party, my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Rory. The subject line was blank. I opened the attachment. It was a scanned deed transfer document from 5 years ago. Rory's message below the image was short. He moved the house into a limited liability company to hide the asset from the IRS during a tax audit. He thought he was being clever. But when your trust bought the mortgage portfolio, you didn't just buy the debt on a house. You bought the debt on his company's primary asset. I stared at the screen. Gerald had tried to cheat the taxman and had accidentally handed me the deed to his life. The house they lived in, the roof over their heads, was technically collateral owned by the daughter they had just tried to declare insane. I looked across the room. Gerald was laughing loudly at a joke made by a city councilman, but his eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit. He had no idea that the floor had already dropped out from under him. I closed my phone and walked back into the light. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin. The legal petition arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a process server who looked bored by the destruction he was handing me. Gerald had officially filed for an emergency evaluation of my competency. The document was a masterpiece of fiction, claiming that I was suffering from delusions, was being financially exploited by unknown third parties, and was no longer fit to manage my own estate. He was asking the court to grant him temporary conservatorship over my person and my assets. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at the county courthouse. It was a closed session, meant to protect the privacy of the family, but the air inside the small courtroom felt suffocated by the weight of their lies. Gerald sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a dark suit that made him look like a grieving patriarch. Linda sat behind him, her face the color of old paper, her hands twisting a handkerchief until the fabric looked like it might tear. Tessa took the stand first. She looked perfect, the picture of a concerned sister, but I could see the tremor in her hands. "Mara has been drifting away for months," Tessa told the judge, her voice catching theatrically. "She refuses to answer calls. She locks herself in her apartment. Last week, she was screaming at our father about things that never happened. She is just not herself. We think someone is influencing her. We just want to protect her." I sat next to David, my hands folded on the table. I did not look at Tessa. I looked at the judge, a stern woman in her 60s who seemed to have little patience for melodrama. When it was our turn, David did not offer an emotional rebuttal. He simply handed over a 3-inch binder of evidence. Your Honor, David said, his voice calm and leveled. We are submitting a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted 48 hours ago by an independent specialist, confirming my client is fully cognizant and capable. We are also submitting her employment records from Northline Ridge Advisory, where she manages high-level compliance risk daily. And finally, we are submitting Exhibit C. Exhibit C was the forensic analysis of the forged loan documents. The judge put on her glasses. The room was silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Gerald shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat, a nervous tic I recognized from his failed business calls. This is preposterous, Gerald whispered to his lawyer, loud enough for the microphone to catch. The judge looked up. Her eyes were hard. Mr. Hartman. Silence. She turned her gaze to me. Ms. Whitfield, do you have anything to say? I stood up. I did not need notes. Your Honor, I said, my voice filling the small room without shouting. This is not a case about a father worrying for his daughter. This is an attempt to gain access to funds by stripping me of my rights as an adult. They do not want to care for me. They want to silence me because I found out they have been stealing my identity for 4 years. The judge looked back at the file. She flipped a page. Then she closed the binder with a sharp thud. Petition denied, she ruled, her tone cutting through the tension like a knife. There is zero evidence of incapacity here. However, based on the documents in Exhibit C regarding the signature discrepancies on the home equity line of credit, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for a fraud investigation. Gerald's face went white. Tessa looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like heat radiating across the aisle. She looked like a queen who had just watched her castle crumble. We moved to the hallway. The moment the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind us, Gerald's composure disintegrated. He lunged toward me, ignoring his lawyer's attempt to grab his arm. You ungrateful little... Gerald shouted, his voice echoing off the marble floors. You will regret doing this to your family. Do you hear me? You are nothing without us. He was screaming. He was red-faced. He was ugly. And he was being watched. Standing near the water fountain, holding a phone with the camera lens pointed directly at Gerald, was the reporter from the charity gala. He had been waiting for a comment on the court case. Instead, he got the headline. Gerald saw the phone. He froze. The realization hit him a second too late. He had just given the world the proof that he was not a concerned father, but a desperate, abusive man losing his grip. I looked at Gerald, then at the reporter, and I kept walking. I did not say a word. I did not have to. Gerald had just destroyed himself. The video of Gerald screaming in the courthouse hallway did not just circulate, it infested Riverton Glen. In a town built on polite appearances, watching the esteemed Gerald Hartman lose control in high definition was a social death sentence. The image of the grieving father cracked and fell away, revealing the tyrant underneath. I did not have to say a word to the press. The internet did the work for me. By Wednesday, the consequences were tangible. The regional bank froze the home equity line of credit and launched a formal fraud investigation. This triggered a domino effect. When a bank smells fraud, they look at everything. They started auditing the cross-collateralization between Gerald's personal accounts and his business loans. Hartman Classic Homes began to crumble, not because of family drama, but because of risk assessment. I watched from a distance as 2 of his major investors pulled out. They sent legal notices citing reputational instability and compliance irregularities. It was the cold, unfeeling hand of the corporate world crushing him, exactly the way he had tried to crush me. That evening, I walked to my car in the parking garage of my office building. Tessa was waiting for me. She was leaning against the concrete pillar, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic exhaustion. "You have to stop this!" Tessa pleaded, her voice echoing in the empty garage. "The bank is talking about criminal charges. You can save Dad. You can stop it if you just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I unlocked my car door. I did not look at her with anger. I looked at her with indifference, which I knew hurt her more. I did not start this. Tessa, I said, you started it when you used my name. I had to, she cried, tears finally spilling over. He made me feel like the whole family would die if I didn't fix the cash flow. I was trying to be a good daughter. No, I corrected her. You were trying to be the favorite. I drove away, leaving her standing in the exhaust fumes. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Linda. She was not crying this time. She sounded hollow. I knew, she whispered. I knew she was using your name. I looked the other way because it kept the peace. I just wanted everyone to get along. You sacrificed me to keep the peace, I said. And now you have neither. Just before I turned off my computer, an email arrived from Rory. It was the final nail in the coffin. It was a forwarded internal email from 3 years ago, sent from Gerald to Tessa. Just handle the signature on the bank docs. Mara is too passive. She would never dare to sue the family. Just get it done so we can make payroll. He had banked on my silence. He had built his entire survival strategy on the assumption that I was too weak to fight back. I forwarded the email to my lawyer and the fraud investigator at the bank. I did not add a caption. The text spoke for itself. The next morning, I found a plain white envelope slipped under my apartment door. It was a handwritten letter from Tessa. I always thought you were the weak one because you never fought back at dinner. Mom always taught us that silence was submission. I see now that I was wrong. I am terrified of you, Mara. Not because of what you are doing, but because you are so calm while you do it. I realized today that I have no idea who you actually are. I placed the letter in the trash. I did not need her fear. I needed her accountability. At noon, my phone rang again. It was Gerald. Mara, he said. His voice was unrecognizable. The boom was gone. The authority was gone. It was the voice of a man standing on a ledge. Please, help me. Just this once. I am losing everything. I looked out the window at the city skyline. I felt absolutely nothing. Meet me at the lawyer's office tomorrow at 9. I said, you will help. He asked, a desperate hope in his voice. We will finish this, I said. I hung up. I was not going there to save him. I was going there to close the book. The conference room at the law firm was nothing like the dining room where this had all started. It was cold, neutral, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive coffee. There were no family portraits here to hide behind, no crystal glasses to catch the light. It was just a table, 4 chairs, and the silence of a judgment day that had arrived 20 years too late. Gerald walked in with a bounce in his step that turned my stomach. He had convinced himself that this meeting was a surrender, that I was there to hand over money, sign the papers, and beg to be let back into the fold. Tessa followed him, her eyes rimmed with red, clutching her purse like a shield. She was still trying to play the role of the dutiful daughter, but the cracks were visible to everyone. Linda trailed behind them, looking at the floor. I am glad you finally came to your senses. Mara, Gerald said, pulling out a chair at the head of the table. We are ready to forgive you. We just need to get this paperwork sorted so we can move on. I did not sit down. I stood at the opposite end of the table and placed 3 documents on the polished wood surface. I laid them out slowly, deliberately, like tarot cards revealing a grim future. There will be no forgiveness today. Gerald, I said, only facts. I pointed to the first document. This is the conclusion letter from the bank's fraud department. It confirms that the signature on the loan application was forged and that the funds were misappropriated to your company accounts. I pointed to the second. This is the court order from yesterday, rejecting your petition for conservatorship and formally warning you that any further attempts to harass me will result in sanctions. Gerald's face began to lose its color. He opened his mouth to speak, but I moved my hand to the third document. And this I said, is a deed of trust. You transferred your home into a limited liability company to hide it from the tax man. My trust fund purchased the mortgage debt on that company 3 years ago. I am the bank. Gerald, I own the roof over your head." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Gerald stared at the paper. He looked at me, then at the paper, his mind struggling to comprehend the shift in power. You are destroying this family," Gerald suddenly shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. "You went behind my back to steal my house. You are a traitor." "The family was not destroyed by the truth," I replied, my voice calm. "It was destroyed by the people who needed lies to survive." I looked at Tessa. She was trembling. "I did not buy the debt to steal the house." I continued. "I bought it because I knew eventually you would try to use the house as a weapon to control me or Tessa. I wanted to make sure you couldn't. If you hadn't committed fraud, you would have lived there in peace forever. You did this to yourself." I slid a final document across the table. It was a confession of guilt regarding the identity theft and a binding agreement to cease all contact. "This is your only option," I said. "You and Tessa will sign this admission. You will retract every lie you told about my mental health. If you do this, I will not pursue civil damages for the $50,000. The district attorney will still investigate the fraud, but I will not add to the fire. If you do not sign, I foreclose on the house tomorrow." Linda let out a soft wail. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Mara, I am so sorry. I let you suffer alone for too long. I should have stopped him." I looked at my mother. I did not feel hate, but I did not feel love either. I felt a distant pity. I nodded once, acknowledging her words, accepting the truth that she was weak, but offering no absolution. Gerald stood up, his face twisted in a mix of rage and desperation. He tried one last time to use the only tool he had left. "I am your father," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I am the one who created you." I looked him dead in the eye. "No," I said. "You are just the man who tried to break me. I created myself." Gerald looked at the pen on the table. He looked at Tessa, who was already reaching for it with a shaking hand. She signed quickly, desperate to stop the walls from falling. Gerald hesitated. He looked around the room, realizing there was no audience left to perform for. He picked up the pen and signed his name in silence, a king stripping himself of his own crown. I picked up the papers. I did not smile. I did not say goodbye. I walked to the door and opened it. "You told me I was not welcome," I said, looking back at them one last time. "But from now on, being unwelcome is my choice." I walked out and closed the door. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. For the first time in 34 years, I was finally home, because home was wherever I decided to be. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you guys are tuning in from, so please drop a comment down below and share your thoughts on Mara's decision. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Victoria Revenge Stories channel, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people. See you in the next one.